Hello, thank you for that introduction. Welcome to Internationalizing Your App. We will be exploring some techniques that you can use to make your app ready to take on the world. Again, my name is Kristina Fox, and I work as a senior iOS engineer at a company called Intuit. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Intuit is a financial software company. I work specifically on an app called QuickBooks Self-Employed. And I am born and raised in California, and I'm currently living and working in the heart of Silicon Valley. Fun fact, I used to be a competitive figure skater for 10 years before becoming a software engineer. OK, now a bit more about the app that I work on. QuickBooks Self-Employed is aimed at freelancers and contractors and helps them manage their business finances and get ready for tax time. Throughout the talk, we'll be coming back to my app from time to time, so I wanted to make sure that you're all familiar with it from the very start. OK, now on to the topic at hand. I'd like to start us off with a definition of internationalization. A topic as broad as this can mean many things to different people, so it's better that we all start off on the same page before moving forward. Here is one definition. There are three key things that internationalization boils down to. The first, being able to support different languages. Second, adapting to regional peculiarities. And the third, handling technical requirements of a particular locale. Let's step into each one of these a little bit deeper, starting with the ability to support different languages. Now, this is probably the one that most of us think of when it comes to internationalization. We want to make sure that our apps can communicate across the board in all different languages. This is one of the most basic principles of internationalization, making sure that our users are able to understand the content that we use within our own apps. Well, that's great. But that being said, there are still multiple concepts within the same language that also still need to be supported. Now, looking deeper into this issue, we start running into content that transcends the idea of being localized in a language sense. Now, technically, most English-speaking countries understand the fundamental concept of Fahrenheit, for example. But unless you're well-versed in converting the values to Celsius, or you live in the United States, like I do, you still may not fully grasp what that means. Now, this brings us to my next point. Regional peculiarities. This is one of my favorite aspects of internationalization, because it forces you to look outside of your technical realm and focus instead on who you're building products for. It's the human side of engineering. Now, to start us off, I thought I would have us look at an example outside of software to get us into the mindset of our users. OK, here's a question. What was your least favorite vegetable as a kid? Any takers? Yeah? Broccoli? Yeah? Where are you from? Argentina? Yes? Parsley. And where are you from? Bulgaria. Yep, up there. Sorry? Lima beans. Oh yeah, those ones are not as fun either. And where are you from? Nice. Surprisingly, it is somewhat of a cultural thing, though as you can see, everybody has their own personal likes and dislikes. So one of the things is, in the United States, for example, most children don't like broccoli. That's pretty much the main hated vegetable there. And in other countries, the vegetable does vary. Now, why is this important? How many of you have seen the movie Inside Out? OK. Now, there's a movie from Pixar Studios that's called Inside Out. And for those of you who haven't seen it before, it explores the emotions of a young girl struggling through a lot of change at one time. Now, there's a scene in the movie where her mom tries to cheer her up by ordering pizza and making a fun night out of it. But she was horrified to discover that the pizza place only does one kind of pizza each day. And unfortunately for her, it's her least favorite topping ever, broccoli. Remember what I said about broccoli in America earlier? Now, when this movie was brought over to Japan, though, the vegetable on the pizza was swapped out in favor of bell peppers. Guess what the least favorite vegetable is for Japanese children? Yep. Pixar decided to localize the vegetable in order to get the most reaction that they could out of their audience and really drive home the point that the main character was just having an awful, awful time at her new home. Another way to think about this is to reflect on all those times that you came across something new that other people just seemed to get. They understood it immediately. How alienating is it to you when something appears that you have absolutely no context with? Now, in the last Apple event, they had a variety of actors come out on stage to introduce new shows for their new Apple TV Plus subscription. And out stepped someone who I personally would never have associated with Apple at all. Now, this is a character named Big Bird, and he is on a children's educational show called Sesame Street. Now, it's a show that was a huge part of my childhood, but for others, I can totally see how it basically just looks like a fluffy, feathered, giant puppet. Like, that's super weird, right? Context really makes all the difference. Not to pick on you, Peter, wherever you are. And even if you understand the context, even if you know Sesame Street, it can still be quite a shock to see a twist on something that you're familiar with. Apparently, Sesame Street even localized the type of bird used so that all of its audiences would see a bird that is common in their own country. One last thing that I'll note is that regional peculiarities don't even have to apply to just small details within your app. Your entire brand can be affected too. When most of us think about going to market in a new country, we almost never think about changing the name of our app. Now, Evernote didn't go that route when they went and entered the Chinese market. They chose the name Yinxing Biji, which can be translated as memory notes. Now, this name also incorporates the Chinese character representing elephant as the second character in the name. What's great about this is that it really ties their translated Chinese version back to their elephant logo and keeps true to their original brand while still making sure that their new audience could understand exactly what you use Evernote for. And last, but certainly not least, are the technical requirements of internationalization. We'll focus most of the rest of the talk on this. Now, here are just a sample of some of the technical requirements introduced with internationalization. Now, before I dive into the rest of these topics, I want to note one more thing that should be at the core of your internationalization strategy. And that's user research. One of the best ways of getting to know your users is to do user studies with them. This is especially important if you aren't familiar with the customs and culture of your users that you're trying to build for. Now, you've probably seen this done in a few different ways. User surveys or polls are probably the most common option. But there are also companies that spend their time reaching out to their users via a phone interview or even inviting them onto campus to do an in-person interview. At my company, we take things one step farther. We'll physically go to someone's business location and interview them in the place where they feel the most comfortable. You often get much more candid feedback than you actually would, and you actually get to see the exact circumstances where people are using your own software. In fact, for my app, since a lot of our users are freelancers who may not have their own business location, we'll often visit them at their home office instead. We like to call them follow me homes. Now, I know what you must be thinking. And yeah, it's a pretty strange concept. And really, it actually can get a little dangerous too sometimes. You never know when your user's cat is going to jump on you, for instance. This is an actual picture of my coworker at a Follow Me Home in San Francisco, where the cat got a little too friendly. Follow Me Homes, though, they really often shed a lot more light about how our users interact with our products, even if we just call them on the phone. Why is this? When you're interviewing someone on the phone, you might not get the whole truth. It's not because they want to lie to you or that they even mean to do it. It's just that usually people like to think about how they would do something rather than how they actually do it. This is especially the case in my industry, in the financial software world, where people have an ideal state that they would like to be in. But in reality, they might not be there. They might not come close to that. Without seeing it in person, though, how would you ever know that yourself? So, as much as all of us would love to be jet-setting around the world and doing user research ourselves, it does take a lot of time, effort, and money. Now, what do you do if true Follow Me Homes are not an option in your case? Now, here are just a couple of other alternatives. There are services out there that will provide cultural consultants who can be on the ground in any country that you're trying to expand to, and they'll do a lot of that legwork for you. You can also look into having virtual testers in these foreign countries test your app and let you know if there are things that they don't understand. The thing to make sure you do, then, is determine exactly which demographic you want to test and come up with a list of identifying traits. If you've ever done a user research study with another company, for example, that's why they usually send out a survey beforehand, so that they can make sure that you fit their target demographic. Great. Now that we've covered a lot of our basics, let's jump right into the technical portion. Let's talk about localization. Now, generally, at a high level, this is what the process typically looks like. During your development process, you'll first convert all user-facing strings in your project into localized strings. From there, you'll generate a strings file. Third, your localization experts will now take that original strings file and then create other strings files for other languages before it all eventually gets put back into your original app. How do you get started with this? You'll want to go through your code base and wrap all user-facing strings with ns-localized string. The comment here can be used to further elaborate on what context the string will be used in. This is especially useful for ambiguous words that could have different meanings in different languages and different settings. Another thing that the comment field is useful for is to provide context for a parameterized value in your string. In this case, we're looking to display the number of songs played. In addition, you can also provide context for how to make your localized string plural. This is done using the localized string with format function. Now here's a look at the .stringsdict plist file. With the creation of this file, you can populate it with rules for how to format each phrase, including all of your plural phrases that you have above. Another thing that you can do, in order to find any non-localized strings within your database or within your code base, there's a setting in your scheme that you can check under the Run tab. And what happens here, once you check this option and rerun your app, errors will show in your console log for any string not found in your localizable strings file. Note that you will have to generate that main strings file first before any of your errors can show. And unfortunately, at this point, it doesn't highlight the file, it doesn't highlight the non-localized strings within your editor. So you will have to basically take your error message, copy and paste it, and search for that non-localized string. There are also a number of data formatters that should be built out. Anything ranging from currency to dates to even how quotes should be displayed should be accounted for in this case. The last thing with localization, you'll also want to support a user moving to another country and changing locales with these two notifications. I definitely make sure to prompt the user before changing things over, though. You never know if they're taking a quick trip and don't want any of their settings to change. In fact, this is probably more likely in most cases. Another thing to consider is if a user will need any additional changes after they have moved. Now, depending on your infrastructure and your app, and whether your app has any app-specific features that are tied to a locale, you may have to perform a larger conversion. So this is something to keep in mind as you're making your app global ready. Now that we understand language localization a little bit better, how do we architect our app in a way that makes global expansion scalable? Honestly, it can be as simple as this. First, taking action after first checking a user's locale is the most basic way to support internationalization. But this can become extremely hard to maintain. What if that code needs to be used in multiple places? Now you have to copy and paste it. What happens if you need to change something? It quickly starts becoming a nightmare, and supporting new locales will be a huge struggle. In our app, we created the concept of a global manager, a single source of truth that holds all of the data needed to support multiple locales. That way, if a new locale is added, it makes it extremely easy to make changes. Now, it should store things like whether a particular location uses metric or the imperial system, what a postal code is called in other countries, the type of currency used, important dates, and other various locale-specific information. You can also use it to initialize locale-specific objects that are also needed. Let's take a look at an example. In this case, we've built out a function that returns what the postal code title should be for a few different countries. It's generic enough that it can be used all around the app wherever addresses are displayed. You can also see that it would be simple to add on another supported country by including one more locale in the custom enum and then adding one more case to the switch statement. Much easier and more scalable than if statements all over the place. Oops. One thing I want to note is that the global manager should not be used for information that is constantly changing. Things like currency rate, for example, change daily and are just not practical to ship in client-side code. This is an example of something that you should be pulling down from your backend server instead. It's really important to be able to differentiate what data should live on the client and what data should live on the server. Now that we've got the basics of our architecture down, what about handling the user interface? Here are a couple of things to keep in mind. Now, out of all of the languages to support, few of them are quite as interesting as all the ones that display right to left. On top of not being able to read or understand the language, the fact that it's not written in the same direction that you're used to reading is also a bit of a challenge. Luckily, if you're using a lot of UIKit standard views and auto layout, a lot of it is built in, as of iOS 9. The main thing to keep in mind as you're building out your views is that you want to use the leading and trailing constant rather than left or right when it comes to text. This will allow you to support right-to-left text and languages almost out of the box. Only use left and right when you really mean for constraints to be set specifically on the left and right side of the views. Now, what about localizing images or animations? Let's take a look at an example. Now, unfortunately, as awesome as this video is, it can't be localized in its current form. Now, we could have a different video for each locale that we support, but that would get harder and harder as we scale to more locations. Also, making a change to an in-product video, animation, or image would be a huge pain in this case. The best thing to do is to remove the text and place it outside of the video itself. But it can look a little boring now with static text and this kind of fun animation. Now, in the QuickBooks Self-Employed app, we have a particularly long loading screen for one of our most data-intensive tasks. And in order to make it more interesting for the user, we ended up putting in a nice little loading animation and got to play around with our content a bit. I decided to add in a little transition between each title to make it a little bit more fun, and it honestly wasn't that much work. Here, I end up rotating through an array of titles, and every 5 seconds that I change the title, I do a flip from top transition. In other words, just because you can't put text into an animation doesn't mean you can't still make it fun. You just have to get a little creative with it. Now, the last, but certainly not least, technical topic is testing. Here are a couple of tips to help you test your app for the global market. As many of you know, when Xcode records UI tests, it'll use the string on the UI element to identify it. So something like this. Now, unfortunately, this does not work in a localized text environment, so you'll have to identify these elements in another way. Here, we can use the accessibility identifier. Now, this is not the same as the accessibility label or the accessibility hint, the ones that Kaya mentioned in her talk earlier today. Both of these are user-facing strings that will be read out via voiceover to the user. Luckily for us, the accessibility identifier is something that's developer-facing only. So when you go to actually write your UI test now, you can use the accessibility identifier to pinpoint the exact UI element that you want to test. Now, no matter what language your app is in, your UI tests should be able to run. Another thing that you can do to test within your app is to use pseudo-languages. Now, if you head to your scheme again and tap on the Run tab, you'll find an option named Application Language. Clicking on that dropdown brings you to a long list of languages. Looks something like this. Down at the very bottom, you'll find pseudo-languages that you can test with. This is especially helpful if you're just getting started with localization and you want to make sure that your UI constraints look good for any length of text. Double length is especially helpful for languages that are much longer than others. Of course, German is a perfect example of that. Great. OK, so we've taken this journey. Our app is global ready. We've gone out to market. And things are looking awesome. Well, until they don't look so awesome anymore. What if things don't work out as planned? Consider this example. Your North American debut went great. As for your European expansion, the numbers could be better, but it's still looking promising for now. Asia, on the other hand, that's a different story. Maybe it's just an issue with marketing and it'll bounce back eventually, but maybe your app doesn't fit the Asian market very well and there's not much you can do to fix it. What do you do now? Now, there comes a time that you may consider having to pull out of a part of your global effort. And it largely boils down to two things at the end of the day. One, how well your product can fit in the market eventually. And two, whether or not you want to continue investing the time and effort in development for those locales. Sometimes it's just not worth it anymore. Now, if that's the case, here are some steps that you can take to make as graceful as an exit as you can. Now remember, things really need to be communicated as far in advance as possible. And you should make sure that you don't bring in any new users only to disappoint them. Make sure that your users can back up any data that they might need before you shut down your servers. It's always a disappointing thing to see our products to see the products that we love leave a market. But at the very least, you can make sure that you do it as gently as possible and not leave your users hanging. And that's it for internationalization. We walked through a number of things today, starting with user research, drilling into some technical tools that you can use, and what to do if things don't go as well as planned. Now, this is just a brief look into what makes your app global ready, but it should be enough to get you started. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks for the nice presentation. How do you do it with videos? Here.
Oh, OK.
How do you do it with the videos when there's text in it?
Yep, that's a really great question. One of the things, so within our app, we primarily use animations, but I know that Google has a service that they're using to do live transcription of videos too, and that they are able to automatically detect the language that you're using within the video. I'm not sure if there's a way for you to localize your videos yet, but if you're using like Google Slides, for example, then any videos that you put in there are able to be translated live in context. And so I'm hoping that eventually they'll be able to roll out a service like that we can use within our own apps too.
Thanks.
Hello.
Oh. Hello.
Hi. With regards to translating strings, currently where I am, we have a separate translating service, and it's a long process where we have to send off strings and then update an enum that then we add it to. Do you have any do you know of any services that are useful without having to depend on human translation, or just as part of the whole localization effort?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know any services. I'll be honest, I am kind of spoiled. I work for a large company that has a translation service built in-house for us. One of the things that we do is we have a beta version of our app that we send out to not only external users, but also we have offices all over the world. And so when we're trying to test in different locales, we have employees within our company in all those different offices that can do a little bit of spot testing for us. So in this case, I'm not sure if that would be super helpful for you, but I would definitely, like I said before, there's a lot of virtual testing services out there, and maybe you can find a target demographic within those virtual testing services to just do spot checks on your localization.
Hi. I saw in your talk that you use standard generic strings that Apple also says in your NS-localized string. Mm-hmm. But what happens if you have 20 translations of that string and branding, design, whatever, thinks, oh, hello world, no, let's call it differently. Then suddenly you have to change all those 20 localizations. Mm-hmm. Why don't you use what we use in our app is basically a huge structure enum, where at least you cannot make errors in the string, and when a string changes, the key doesn't change. So the NS-localized string is not a string, it's a key.
Yeah.
So it's safer and it's more future-proof, etc. And if the English original text changes, you don't have to change all the keys. Mm-hmm. That's just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. At least at this point, this is primarily what I've been using within our app. But again, I support 4 locales, so very different than the 20 locales that you're supporting. But yeah, that totally makes sense. If you have any resources, I would love to see those. You can send them my way. Great, thank you.
A question here. Thank you for the talk, Kristina. Mm-hmm. You mentioned about automated testing, that you can use the accessibility identifier. Mm-hmm. That's for the UI tests. I wonder, do you have some tips or some experience with like automating checks for different markets, and like if you can't rely on your colleagues in different locations to test, to kind of have some automation around this?
Yes.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, totally. I honestly, we do rely a lot on our automated UI testing to be able to catch regressions in those areas. Another thing that we've done before too is use snapshot testing for regression purposes too. Snapshot testing not in different languages, primarily the UI testing for that. But in terms of like constraint issues, for example, that's where we typically use a lot of our snapshot testing. Okay, great, thank you.